All right. Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. I'm John Schwabish from the Urban Institute. Thanks for tuning in to today's Data at Urban digital discussion. Very excited to have two of my colleagues, Rob Santos and Diana Elliot, here. They are going to talk about their work on the 2020 census. And what is, of course, most relevant right now is how the COVID pandemic will impact the count in the 2020 census and what Census Bureau is doing. So I thought we would just start quickly with some introductions, and then I'll just ask like a most general question I can ask. So Diana, do you want to just give a quick introduction to yourself, and we'll start from there?
Sure. I'm Diana Elliot. I'm a senior researcher at Urban Institute, and I have the incredible distinction and pleasure of having been at the Census Bureau during the 2010 census. So I get really excited about the census and about Census Day. So I'm looking forward to your questions and excited for this chat.
Great. Rob?
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rob Santos. I'm the Vice President and Chief Methodologist here at the Urban Institute, and I have the distinct pleasure of being able to work with folks like John and especially Diana on things related to census. I've been a big fan and supporter of the census and all that it does as perhaps the major statistical, federal statistical agency in the US. And I'm ready to talk and to collaborate here with Diana and to answer your questions.
Great. That's great. It's a great start. So like we've been doing the last couple of weeks, if you have questions, just drop them in the chat box, and I'll just put you in an order so you can just ask your own questions. I'm not gonna, unless you want me to read them aloud, I'll just let you all chat. So this is about as laid back as you can get. So I thought we would start with the obvious question, the topic of the blog post that I just put in the chat box, which is, how is the COVID pandemic going to impact the 2020 census? And I will just open that up to the two of you, and you can just argue who wants to go first.
Diana, you go.
Sure. So I can start with the blog post that we just released yesterday, where we talk about how unpredictable residency during the census is going to be an issue. Right? Tomorrow is April 1. It's the day where people are supposed to report where they are, and they're supposed to report from that residence about their usual residence. But in the light of the pandemic, there's a lot of people who've been migrating within the US, right? They're not necessarily living at their usual residence. There's been a lot of news stories about people leaving New York City, for example, going to second homes, stories about college students leaving colleges, stories about people moving in with their older relatives, and also stories about how people are at risk for eviction right now because of lost wages. So it really kind of casts this big question around, what is a usual residence? How does that work in the middle of this pandemic? And will people actually read the instructions and guidance and know how to answer the question about their usual residence? So I think there's a lot of questions about how do we understand the counts? And of course, there's implications for this moving forward, because if, for example, New York City has a big population loss on April 1st, that impacts their funding for the next 10 years. So that's something that's really, I've been thinking about a lot. And then Rob and I had an earlier blog just last week, I'm losing track of time, that also talked about how this is going to impact, right? Will you be able to hire enumerators? Will those enumerators go to the doors of the hard to count, where we know that's the critical group that we need to reach with that in-person contact? Rob, do you want to explicate a little
certainly.
bit more? Yeah.
Absolutely. The residency issue is yet one additional complexity to the enormous task that the Census Bureau has before it in light of the COVID crisis. In addition, there are the obvious things. There's the public health issue. Now and arguably through the summer may not be the best time to deploy 500,000 people to go knocking on doors when asymptomatic people can spread the virus. So there are those types of issues. There are the issues of the requirement by Title 13 that all counts be submitted by by the end of December of this year. Because of that, the Census Bureau has absolutely no choice but to raise its hand and say, we can do it and we're gonna do it, because they don't have a choice. They have to submit something. So what we argue is that because of the public health crisis, there should be some type of expansion of the data collection period, some postponement, and we even threw out the word cancel, but that isn't going to happen because it's constitutionally mandated. But just to provoke ideas and what do we need to do? How do we leverage stuff? You know, the current byline of the Census Bureau is that it's never been easier to fulfill the census. You can do it by online. You can do it by calling in. You can fill out the form and send it back in the mail. All of that is true, but it also all applies to the easiest to count populations. The real challenge is going to be the hard to count. And as hard as it was going to be anyway without COVID, adding on top of that the COVID epidemic just throws the difficulty into a different universe. And so the notion that, oh, we kick the can every couple of weeks to delay, say, the update enumerate or the update leave, which is one of the early field staff functions of the census, or delay the knocking on doors for the non-response follow-up, the NRFU. I mean, all that is fine, but it's missing the huge point that drastic, much more bold action is needed in order to come to grips with the threat and the challenge that's before the 2020 census. And that's the type of things we want to talk about here today.
Can you talk a little bit about the disparity or the equity issues that are going through that could show up if they abide by their current deadline of the end of the year? So if they're unable to go out into the field and ask questions the way they're supposed to ask the questions, which areas are likely to be even more severely undercounted than they would have been?
Yeah, I mean, the Census Bureau has a really great tool called Roam, where you can go and you can look at where some of those areas are. They also have another tool that does sort of, pretty frequent updates of where these counts are coming in. We know, however, that certain geographies are really hard to count. So, for example, the Rio Grande Valley, right? It's an area where it's really lots of hard to count people for various reasons, right? So, for example, in those areas, the face-to-face enumeration is going to be critical. Community partnerships are going to be critical. But how do you do that in this environment where you can't have those face-to-face interactions? You can't have that trust that really comes through the face-to-face. So I think that's one of the concerns right now, is that there's so much face-to-face and trust building and community outreach that needs to happen to count those groups. But how does that happen in this new environment?
In terms of the Roam, if you also look at the response rate map, you'll be able to see, you can dive down into the county and city levels within a state. And because I live in Austin, Texas and work remotely, I've been keeping track of what's going on in terms of the current self-response rate in Texas. And lo and behold, it's mimicking what is on the Roam map. My notion is that what's going to happen is that the self-response rates are going to increase rapidly during the COVID epidemic, because people are stuck at home and they don't have anything to do, so why not do the census? But like I said, those are the easy to count. And it's going to end up plateauing at the end of the easy to count population, which will leave this huge hole, which is mostly the most vulnerable populations in the country. Latinx population, African Americans, missing young children, people in rural areas without addresses, mailable addresses and so forth, homeless. That's going to be the big issue. They're going to be undercounted, and those communities that tend to have more of those individual types of residents are going to be the folks that lose out on political representation and funding.
Can you talk a little bit about, and I know you're not going to know the answer to this because none of us do, but the impact of the timing of this, right? We have, jurisdictions are seeing these sort of waves of infections of COVID because of just the timing, right? That I think, here in Virginia, the experts are saying that we're sort of 2 weeks behind New York. And I'm sure other places around the country are even further behind. So how does that, have you thought about in any depth how the timing of these curves could impact how people and when they respond to the census forms?
I think it really impacts when enumerators can go out into the field, or when field operations can really resume in a way that's safe for everyone. So I think that's an important consideration. I don't know what that looks like, however. When is it really safe for people to go and resume sort of these face-to-face interactions? There could be staged field operations, but I haven't seen any information from the Census Bureau about that. And so far, they've just delayed it by a piecemeal sort of incremental strategy, when actually in my gut, I think this is going to require a much more sort of long-term strategy for how to do this.
Yeah, I would agree. And there is also this notion, and I think the White House is finally realizing it, that you can't sort of start up the economy right now because there isn't like a flare in Wyoming or Idaho or wherever, while there is in New York. The notion is that the totality of your jurisdiction of the nation needs to be secured for a period of time, because if you don't do that, people travel from a hot area to a non-hot area, as Diana was discussing with the residency issue, and you'll end up with a flare-up. So my recommendation, not that Census would ask me, but I'll give it anyway, would be to go ahead and basically suspend operations until it's time for it to commence in the entirety of the nation, rather than risk basically contaminating an area that wasn't yet hit, or that could be a subject of a second wave of infection, which we know is going to be happening. Folks are already planning for it, and we're seeing it in other countries.
And to clarify, to just add on to that, not a suspension of all operations, just a suspension of the in-person field operations, right?
Thank you, Diana.
So there's a couple of questions in the chat box that I think are fairly closely related. So one from Jennifer on, can the census add a question can the Bureau add a question to the census about how this information was different before or after April 1st? And then another question from Roxanne about what is the process by which the Bureau would have to go through if they decided they did need to delay the census. There's a constitutional mandate, right? So Rob, you already mentioned this, but how do they say, well, if we can't get it done now, how do they extend it into 2021?
I can answer that one, but Diana, you want to do the first?
No, go for it.
Oh, okay, I'll do the second one then. In terms of the pushback, the date for submission at the end of December of this year is part of Title 13, which is the Census Act. It's a piece of legislation. It's part of the U.S. Code. That is malleable. Congress can actually change that to whatever time frame it wants. And so it's interesting. We have a federal system that's made up of, Congress, the executive branch. You have all these different agencies and departments, HHS, CDC, Census Bureau, and they seem to be working within their own stovepipes rather than collectively saying, here is a national crisis. How can we best coordinate? Because it's obvious to anyone that seriously looks at what's going on that there's no way that reliable counts are going to be generated by the end of December. It's implausible. So why can't Congress be working with the Department of Commerce and CDC, et cetera, to say, okay, it's constitutionally mandated, so let's go ahead and do the census in some fashion that's delayed, that allows the gathering of good information, but push the date off for reporting by a year or by 6 months, or something that's meaningful, rather than this 2 week here and 2 week there kicking the can on the road. So it can be changed, and it would be changed by an amendment, and it could be just for 2020 to for the 2020 census, changed as an amendment to Title 13.
And regarding that first question about, can questions be added? They can't be added to the official census at this point, right? That was why the citizenship question sort of flared up in June. That was the deadline for questions being added. But there's no reason why there couldn't be something added to the internal sort of data that enumerators themselves fill out that could sort of speak something to, here's what I'm seeing at this household, they have COVID-19, come back later, right? So I don't know if that's something that's being discussed internally at the Census Bureau, but it could be an operational sort of consideration moving forward.
Right. So I'm happy to keep asking questions, because it's not all the time I have you two like on the same call. So I'm happy to keep asking questions. But if folks have questions for either Diana or Rob, just feel free to chime in. And
I'm happy, by the way, to answer Sarah's question from Barcelona. I was just there last April, by the way. The projection, broader on data projection. I thought you meant data protection, but I'll make a comment on data protection.
Yeah.
And that is that data protection is at the valued at a very high level and stated explicitly in Title 13. The Census Bureau has gone through extraordinary means to develop a new concept and methodology called differential privacy, in conjunction with researchers, other mathematical statistical researchers and so forth, to create data tabulations that would withstand the issue of disclosure. However, there are some risks associated with it, that it removes too much information at small geographic levels. Actually postponing the submission of the counts would allow for a longer period of due diligence by both the research community and the Census Bureau, so that they could be better prepared to deliver counts that can withstand disclosure, yet retain as much information as possible for policymakers and so forth.
Yeah, there's some more questions in here. So if Jay June, if you want to unmute yourself, you're welcome to ask your own question. Roxanne, same thing. And then I see Jennifer's hand is up there in the window. So feel free to unmute yourself if you'd like, and you can ask directly.
This is Jennifer Bocher, a fan of the Census Bureau, particularly the economic census. But the Census Bureau has done a really good job of advertising and advocacy and getting the message out for the population that they were targeting. However, with the coronavirus, do you think that there should be, and do you think their urban, your organization could be partnering with other organizations now that there's a whole different scenario? And how do you suggest that goes about that partnering, or should it just be a plead for help?
So, I mean, I think, and this is something that we put forth in our blog that just came out yesterday, but one of the most important things to do, I think, is just for the Census Bureau to get clarification out there. I know that there's been, there are ad campaigns going on, but the ad campaigns have been created and were created long ago before the pandemic. I think right now there needs to be immediate ad campaigns that tell people, you know, what do you do? What is your usual residence? How do you do this? What do you do in this scenario? Because I think there's a lot of confusion and people want to do the right thing. They just don't know what that is right now. But in terms of partnering, you know, we're trying to do what we can from our platform at Urban, but Rob and I are very passionate about this. We're happy to sort of do more. And I think chats like this are a great way to get the message out there. We certainly try to do what we can from our communications platform. But we're in the process of thinking of new ways that we can actually extend our research, our previous research, in order to make an impact and help communities in this new uncertain era. Rob, do you want to add on to that?
Certainly. We have, with our previous feature back in June that estimated miscounts under different scenarios, estimated miscounts for the 2020 census, had briefings with groups of community organizations that were organized by the Leadership Conference. And so I believe that we got to a fair number of the individuals and the groups that were going to be doing some of the grassroots level organizing and getting the count out. That included folks like Naleo and MALDEF and folks from the Latino side and NAACP and so forth. But more needs to be done, obviously. The big challenge is that the Census Bureau let out upwards of $500 million in grants to various community-based organizations to work with their complete count communities. And the challenge, the problem is that most of their outreach efforts were in-person human interactions, going to libraries and setting up shop, going to grocery stores, putting out flyers door to door, going to school meetings, and so PTA meetings and so forth, going to churches, house of worship type of thing. Those cannot be done now because of the COVID epidemic. And so what needs to replace them? We've always been convinced that peer-to-peer communication is the most effective for getting the hard to count individuals to recognize that they need and they deserve to be counted. And that's been our message. Now, how do you do that in the midst of a national epidemic? One way might be, and this is like pie in the sky, but the Census Bureau has this massive asset of individuals in the midst of being hired, as well as all these community-based organizations. If you took a broader view of the federal system, why not leverage that to help get messaging out for the public health? Because public health has to come before a census. And messaging out that says, here's where you can get food, here's where you can, get medical issues, et cetera, et cetera. Here are the things that you need. Here's how you can get your check that's coming. At the same time you do that, you're building trust for a subsequent message of participating in the census, because otherwise you're simply left with somebody knocking on the door or sending a random text message or calling that individuals don't know, and they're already hard to count. They're not going to necessarily want to open the door. But if you reach out to them and provide them with something that they need, because people are suffering, they need food, they need electricity, they need rent paid, or landlords to back off. We can help with that. The federal system can help with that. And if we could do that, we could engender the type of trust that you need in order to do a much more effective grassroots effort to get the count out. It will be an illustration of why it's important to do the census.
And I'll just add on briefly to that. You know, everyone on this chat knows about the census, knows how important it is. It really appreciates the census. But there's really good research out there that census is done around communications that show that not everyone in the country knows about the census. Not everyone knows how important it is. So we're still dealing with that in the midst of the pandemic as well.
And remember, up until a few weeks ago, and maybe even including a few weeks ago, there were still ICE raids in New York, except the ICE officers had masks when they arrested folks. So there's not a lot of trust engendered with the federal government in some communities, like immigrant communities.
Right. So there's a few questions sort of teed up. So just to let people know, so Roxanne, you can go, and then Jay June, you can go, and then Mia, if you want to ask your question, you should feel free to go. So I'll leave it to Roxanne. You can start.
Thank you. I wanted to know, beyond COVID-19, if there are kind of like criticisms of just in general how the census is done. I know it traditionally undercounts people, and like what are some models maybe in other countries that people look to that's a more ideal way to conduct the census, and that would maybe be more ideal in a pandemic like this?
So I can take the first part if you want to take the second part, Rob.
You'll just have to remind me what the second part was. Go ahead.
Of other countries. But in terms of you know, the hard to count right now, and actually you'll have to repeat your question now, because now I'm focused on the second part and not on the first part.
Oh, sorry, if I can remember. So pretty much, are there more ideal ways to, are there just criticisms about how the census is done in general besides COVID-19? And part two is, what are some models in other countries that's a better way to do the census?
Yeah. So the first part of that, you know, there have been criticisms, right? So the Census Bureau for 2020 changed their operational plan. And there's good reason for that, right? They're trying to do more with less, right? It's become a more complex country to count. And they haven't necessarily gotten the steady stream and the necessary increase in funding that's really required to do this job properly. So in compensation, the operational plan really changed for 2020, right? And part of that is having this new online mode of answering the census, which is terrific for people who know about the census, who typically respond right off the bat, who have internet connections, who generally are more advantaged homeowners, right? We know from Census Bureau research already that the more advantaged homeowners are the ones who are more likely to respond online. They're also the more likely group to respond, period, to the census. So in compensation, right, for these shifts in funding, there's more of this focus on internet first answering of the census. And there's actually sort of a scaled back field operations plan, right? So hiring is not necessarily increased in 2020 above 2010. You're not necessarily going to have as much door knocking this time around. And you know, the advertising has shifted a little. They've been having trouble meeting the mark on hiring people. Who knows what's going to happen now with COVID-19, because you know, you have more people out of work, but are people going to want to go door to door? I think there's a big question around that. So in terms of shifts in operational plans, I think there has been some critique, and we certainly found this to be the case when we looked at our projections, that the hard to count are going to be harder to count with these operational changes. And I think that is a real criticism, but again, keeping in mind that the Census Bureau is doing what it has to do to stay pace with this modern world, and also with the scaled back funding that it really has this time around. And Rob, do you have examples from other countries?
Yes. I have an example from all of Europe, I believe. Europe basically maintains a registry of every resident in the country. So in a real sense, they don't have to do a census because it's already done. They use administrative records. If there's anyone from Europe who can chime in via chat and with more information about that, that would be great. But based on my knowledge, they basically use administrative records. They don't go knocking on doors. That is the easy way to do it. However, that means a loss of privacy, having a registry of every single individual in that form and the way they use it then for all different types of commerce and so forth. In the US, there is this high value protection for privacy. And because of that, historically, we have always railed against this idea that everybody has to have an ID card at the federal level that notifies who you are and why you're here and that you're okay to be here. I don't see that changing anytime soon. And so we have to live with the consequences of that, one of which is that we then have to rely on people's sense of civic engagement in order to conduct the census. One thing that's worthy of note, though, is that if you don't respond, the Census Bureau, to your 2020 census, the Census Bureau, yes, they'll send somebody out to knock on your door. If you don't respond, and they have good administrative records, they'll fill in the form for you using those administrative records. If they don't have that, they'll knock on your neighbor's door or they'll go to the landlord and they'll say, tell me who lives there, and they'll fill out the form for you. And even then, if they can't get that any of that information and they believe that that household or address is occupied, they'll come up with a statistical method and fill in the form on that household's behalf. They've never really done any type of checking to see how accurate that is. It would be hard to do because if somebody's not going to answer a census, they're certainly not going to answer a survey, and they're not going to tell you whether or not you guessed right in your imputations. So there are a lot of challenges. The census has every census has had errors. Some are better than others. The 2010 was supposed to be one of the most accurate. However, it was unfair because overall, the total count was accurate, but they overcounted a lot of people and included a lot of people that they shouldn't have, and they undercounted African Americans, Latinx, some Asians, Native Americans, people in rural areas, etc. They're hard to count.
Yeah, those were great. I can just listen. This is great for me. I think Jay June may be up next.
Hi, yes.
Yeah, great.
Great. So I just had actually have additional questions. So 2 questions. The first question is just about the reference date. I think I saw in your blog that you also mentioned that when operations get pushed back, it gets further away from the reference date, and that introduces concerns about statistical quality. I wonder if you could just speak more to that and explain that in a bit more detail. And then the second question is regarding administrative records. I know the Urban Institute put out a report a couple of years ago poking some holes into administrative records and quote unquote what one might call hard to count communities within administrative records. And the fact that the COVID-19 pandemic may result in, as Ken Pruitt hypothesized, the Bureau relying more heavily on administrative records. I wonder if you could kind of perhaps, if you have any concerns about that or if you have any thoughts about that, that'd be welcome as well. Thank you.
Who goes first?
Thank you.
Okay, let's see. Okay, remind me of the first question again.
Sure, that's a reference date, April 1st.
Okay, it is true that the farther you get from the reference date, the more likely there will be to be a higher proportion of errors when you report. So now go through a thought, everybody go through a thought experiment with me. What was the household composition, your household composition on August 15th? So that would be about the same amount of time if we delayed the census like another X number of months, I think into September or October. Now, I bet everyone could very accurately, that's on this call, could very accurately recall what their household composition was back in the middle of August. But imagine someone who's moved 3 times, or that had family members join them during that period of time for an extended period because of a national crisis. And then they were there sometimes and not others. Or some people came and they're still here, 9 months later or 7 months later. Do you count them, even though they were there in the middle of August or not? Because they came before in July, because there was this big crisis. Well, those types of things are just going to embed such confusion in people. They're not going to know what to answer. And at the time that they decide to answer the census form, they're going to be looking at a screen or a sheet of paper or talking to a Census Bureau field staff person. And they're not going to be able to reference, they're going to just have a tough time cognitively regenerating what the experience was back then in order to then look for the directions on who should be included and who shouldn't be included, apply those, do the calculus, and then say, therefore, these are the people that should be in there. So my guess is everyone here could easily answer the question, but the more you start thinking about the plight of the hard to count populations, the most vulnerable, people who were ill and had to go to the hospital, or who were in nursing homes and they brought them back out so they could care for them during the COVID crisis, or people who moved in with families because they couldn't afford rent, or you moved around because you couldn't afford the rent there and the landlord kicked you out when they weren't supposed to. Those are traumatic things and it may just discombobulate the whole enumeration effort. That's why we said that in this particular time, because of COVID, the longer you take, the more likely you're going to have larger errors.
Diana, did you want to chime in on either of those?
I thought that was a perfect response.
That's perfect. All right. I think there was one other person who had a question.
No, there was a second question.
Oh, right.
And I don't remember what that was.
Minister of Records.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, the Census Bureau is relying heavily on administrative records, especially for their master address files. And they actually used satellite imagery to find households in rural areas that didn't have mailable addresses. They've done some really amazing stuff. But the big issue is going to be using it for imputation to fill in people's forms. And there, the results of Census Bureau's own research is mixed. They know it's not perfect all the time. They say it's perfect 90% of the time. Well, my fear is that most of those types of folks are going to be the easy to count, so they're not going to need them. So the real issue is the quality of administrative data for the hard to count populations, and that's going to be a big problem. Above all, this whole idea of imputation, filling in a form on a person or a household's behalf, I think that practice will skyrocket for this particular census. It will be double or triple, I'm guessing, what it ever was because of the use of administrative records and because of the COVID crisis.
And again, we know that the quality of those data are inferior. So again, it's another way in which the count are even harder to count, and the quality of their data is not as accurate. So I think this compounds the concerns that we have about how those groups are being counted this time around and in the decennial census.
Yeah, I think, well, I think Mia had a question. I don't know if she still wants to ask her question.
Kind of. Yes, hello everyone. I would like your take. There were some good answers in the chat, but definitely would like to hear more. I've been looking at the Census Bureau visualization that shows the current response rates for my area. And my big question was, how does that compare with, where we are now versus where we were in 2010? And, your thoughts on what that reflects. Is it reflecting that, things are easier with the online reporting, or that things are not working as well because of the obvious crisis? Thanks.
So I think we know that things are happening a little bit more in advance of April 1 because of this online mode. So in that regard, right, we have early indications that there's great participation, but again, it's generally those groups who tend to be really responsive to answering. So I saw some estimates where things are hovering around 33% in some areas have responded, which is terrific. The Census Bureau, their low threshold for online responses, what they want to achieve is about 55%. We used different benchmarks in our research. We used around 55.5% as a sort of a high risk threshold, not as many people answering online or self-responding versus 60.5, which is really where Census thinks it's going to be. So, I mean, in that regard, it's more than halfway to its goal for self-response. So that's terrific. But I think we really have to bear in mind that these are the groups who are always going to answer first. So, I think take it with a grain of salt. I've seen some, reports that, yay, we're doing great as a country. I think that's true. But I think, again, it's a certain segment of the country who's really responding right now.
Sure, that makes sense. Thanks.
Jennifer had a question. Well, I think it was a question / a comment about counting your kids, your college age kids. But how is that being impacted now with maybe college kids are not actually in college and they're living with you? Or as I was talking to someone that we work with this morning, her daughter's living with her, along with 2 of her classmates are living there because I think the parents were in New York City and they didn't want to go home. So how does these groups that in the past we might say, oh, they're separate, but now they're living with you, like how do you think that affects the count?
Diana.
You want me to go? I think you're better at this one.
Okay, if you want, I can. we can both do it.
I think again, here's where this is the question about group quarters as well, right? And I think the group quarters counts this time around are going to be challenging. So typically, college students are counted in their colleges, right? But what does that look like now? Now that they're all living at home, and are the colleges going to be doing this? Are there just earnest parents who want to report and see that question and answer that all their kids are there because they want their kids to be counted? Again, going back to what we wrote about in our blog, people don't tend to read instructions. So are they going to read instructions and really figure out how to answer this the right way for their college students, leaving their college students out and assuming that colleges are going to answer? Rob, do you want to tag onto this now?
Sure. The technical answer is that the college kids living away from home at the university need to be counted in that other location at the university, even if COVID got them out of that into their parents' house.
Okay.
Yeah, that's the bottom line. And there's 2 situations there. One is inside dorms and outside dorms. If it was outside dorms, like in a 3 or 4 kids got together and rented an apartment outside of campus, then they're supposed to respond as a household themselves. And there are now videos that are out there from the Census Bureau encouraging those students who lived outside of campus in a different, in their school to go ahead and submit a response. Inside of campus at the dorm, interestingly, they're saying, don't worry about responding because we're going to go to the college and get the complete list of all the kids in the dorm. Census Bureau actually has a separate field staff that is going out to colleges to do the special group quarters enumeration. They're also doing it in nursing homes. and so forth. And they're going to soup kitchens for that census day with the homeless, all of which is off because it requires human interaction. But that's the plan, basically, that's how they're going to do it.
This is Jennifer Bocher. I asked that question. I work at Georgetown University, and our provost is Robert Groves, former director of the Census Bureau. So he has a bit of a voice of authority. And what he put out, which was actually the Census Bureau thing, it said that the Census Bureau has a way to knot out the duplicates.
Mm-hmm.
So when in doubt, put it in. When in doubt, you're saying, I'm not sure if I was counted here or there, put it in. And that's, I think, should be a message that we should be repeating in this time of, what, were you there or were you not? Just put it in, because we just need, they have a way of figuring this out.
We need to count people, put them in.
So I think that underscores an earlier theme that we were talking about, which is there needs to be more time at the Census Bureau for processing, right? Because this is going to be a lot of work to make sure that the data are clean and sort of rectified before they go forth to Congress. I'm worried that we still have this December 31st deadline for turning in final numbers, given all of the sort of upheaval that's happened.
One of the things you also have to remember with the data that's coming in or going in, that's being the only real data that has to come from the count is for appropriations, and appropriations for the representation in Congress. The other stuff, I think there's going to be an awful lot of tweaking and algorithms and fixing and things like that I think that we're just going to have to accept that, and there'll be always an asterisk beside that number whenever someone's ever going to do a historical analysis. But the only numbers that have to be based upon, was this person counted, is that congressional appropriations.
But for that, we need to know where they are. We need to deal with duplicates. I think it's going to be a mess. But agreed. That really is the bottom line of what needs to happen by December 31st. I don't know. Maybe I'm being too cynical about this, but I think that's a huge task given all of the upheaval happening right now.
I'll give two personal examples. I have a nephew who lived in Brooklyn, and when the coronavirus epidemic first started in New York, he's a smart kid. He did some calculations, and he decided he needed to get the heck out of there, jumped in his pickup truck and drove to San Antonio. And now he's hunkered down there, and for the foreseeable future, he's not going back because he can work remotely. And my daughter, who lives with our two grandkids and her daughters in Little Rock, they decided they didn't want to be there alone by themselves. They schlepped down from Little Rock to Austin, Texas. They moved in with us. They don't anticipate going back, and possibly even, we're already talking about registering the kids in September. Well, they did that in March. Does that mean that they're permanently here now that we're going to register the kids and they're moving? Or do we count them back in Arkansas because they still have a rental property over there? There's issues like that that we have to deal with.
I don't see, I just want to see if there are any other questions. We got about 9 minutes till the end of the hour. I don't see any other questions popping up. So maybe I'll ask one more to branch out from the specific issue of the census into other surveys. There's a lot of surveys that the government typically runs. I mean, Friday we're supposed to get the unemployment numbers. Have you talked or thought at all about what the impact of COVID might be on other surveys, either your regular monthly surveys like the unemployment survey, or on surveys that we use all the time like the PSID or SIP or the ACF? I mean, there's a whole slew of them. So what are the impact? Are we talking about the same kind of impacts on those types of surveys?
Quick answer is yes. In fact, The American Community Survey, the CPS, the crime victimization study, the in-person components of those are currently suspended. That has to affect data quality because, like for CPS, it has to be reported out monthly. So that part's lost. And the other piece is that they all calibrate to population projections. The population projections start with the most recent decennial census and then use demographic analysis to create each year subsequent projection for each state. And that means, births, deaths, migrations, etc. So if you have a flawed census, that means the projections have baked into them the decennial errors. That can affect eligibility statuses, that can affect CPIs, that can affect a whole host of things that are used from our federal statistical surveys that are now at a standstill in terms of the in-person component. And so we really have to be careful about those and recognize that there are going to be some quality issues going forward until the data collection life, so to speak, gets back to normal. Diana, do you have some stuff to add to that?
No, that was, I think my big worry is not just what's going on right now, but how this is going to impact the next 10 years. And Rob addressed that with sort of, the decennial census really being the baseline for weights in the ACS, for example. So making sure that we get it right in 2020 is of critical importance.
So we're about out of time. So, and you've both covered a ton here, and I hope it was helpful for folks. I'd like to give you just a chance to maybe make one last point or sort of summarize what you think is going to happen, what you think folks can do, and what you might be doing over the next few weeks and months as you continue to analyze this. So that's a very open, that's sort of like that reporter, like, do you have anything to add sort of question. So super open-ended. So Diane, I'll let you go first, and you can, whatever. Yeah, whatever.
Okay. Well, I think at the end of the day, just get out the word. We all have to get out the word how important this is, and it's really a matter of doing what we can to amplify this message right now. We need everyone to be counted. We need to get this word out. We need to get this word out in communities where typically people are not as inclined to answer or respond to the census. So if you are connected and live in those communities, like, make sure that everyone kind of knows how important this is. And sometimes those messages are about, this impacts your community. This impacts the funding that kids get in schools for the next 10 years. But trying to sort of build that case for persuasion is really important. And then I think secondly, again, clarifying, how people should think about reporting college students, or how people should think about reporting their temporary address. Again, I think some quick sort of responsive messaging from the Census Bureau about thinking about usual residents is really important, because I don't know if anyone's looked at the instructions that lead up to that first question, which is about, how many people were living in this household on April 1st. But that, in the era of this pandemic, is going to be, people are going to answer it based on a temporary residence. They're not going to read those instructions. So doing what you can to get the message out about what that means, and hopefully getting census to also come out with official communications that clarify this for people, I think is really important.
Rob, you have any last words of wisdom
I
in the great state of Texas?
Yeah, absolutely. I have a couple of thoughts that are that sort of speak to this whole issue of the census and the challenge it has ahead of us. Diane and I are doing research on the census. We're writing blogs. Some may view those as being critical of the Census Bureau and what it's doing. But in reality, what we're trying to do is to support the census operation and the Census Bureau as much as possible, and especially to get it to pivot to some bold action that can lead to much more meaningfully accurate counts. Because the present track that it's going on does not bode well for the quality of the counts at the end of the day under a current December submission date. And so we're going to do our best to shake the limbs and shake the leaves and say, hey guys, we really need to wake up and do some drastic action here. Now I know that Census Bureau has a COVID planning team. I'm sure they're excellent. They know a lot more than we do about what's going on and what could go on. I'm just hoping and praying that they have the worst case scenarios laid out, because I don't think it's getting any better. It's going to go towards worse. And they need to be ready to to plan and implement in a bold fashion so we can salvage the best possible 2020 census.
Yeah. Well, that's great. Rob, Diana, thanks so much for chatting with everybody. I hope this was useful for folks. There are a lot of information in the chat box. So a lot of things that Diana and Rob have written most recently, and then the big project last year. I'll also say that on the chat we did yesterday with Graham McDonald and Claire Bowen, who are also urban colleagues, we talked about data privacy and data security. So that video they're all being recorded, so that video should be up in the next couple of days if you are interested in that. I only mentioned that because it came up a bunch of times in the chat box. And we'll be doing more of these discussions the rest of the week. Let's see, the rest of this week is Manuel Lima tomorrow, who works on data visualization. Back to some more data viz stuff, true data viz stuff. So Gregor Eisch and Lisa Charlotte Roast about Data Wrapper, and then Rico Bertini and Mort Steffener on Friday to talk about the Data Stories podcast and some other things. So again, Rob, Diana,